when you talk about critical pedagogy, you're talking about forms of teaching and learning and acting in and on the world that are designed for the liberation of social life in general. And I started out as, in my academic life, as a progressive. I was a progressive. I guess you could call me a left liberal progressive who was very interested in discourse, in psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, anthropology, sociology, et cetera, semiotics. And then came the turn towards postmodernism, postmodern theory. You know, there's a difference between postmodern theory and postmodern society. We kind of have to make a distinction. But I became a transdisciplinary scholar, and I was very interested in the linguistic turn, and described myself for a long time as a critical postmodernist, because I was interested in issues around the economy, the materiality of social life. My own working class background had impacted me a great deal in my own formation as an educator. And so about, I guess it was the late 1980s, I began to read criticisms of my work. Now, many, educators that I know in universities don't read their critics. They just, I took the criticisms of my work seriously. And there was a group of Marxists in England that appreciated my work, but at the same time, they pointed out the limitations of my analysis. I met some of them when I was in Germany, just after the wall fell. I went to Halle to support East German professors who were being kicked out of the universities and replaced by West German professors. And there was a conference about this. And I met some of the British Marxists and had some intense conversations with them. The Birmingham School of Contemporary Cultural Studies did make an impact on me, but I have a critique of some of that work in terms of their approach to Gramsci. But yes, Paul Willis, Stuart Hall, there were many James Donald, there were many important thinkers that came out of that. In some way, their work was designed to bring Marx into the discussion, but in some ways I think they pushed Marx out. But that's a long story. But I appreciate their work a great deal. So I was working a lot with Henry Giroux. Henry was an early mentor of mine, a very strong intellectual, and I had read a book by Stanley Aronowitz, which was called The Crisis in Historical Materialism. And so that was a critique of historical materialism. So I was, at that time, not ready to really put my energies into Marx. Now, it was interesting. I came across a book just in my own independent research, it wasn't recommended to me, by Raya Dunayevskaya. Now, Raya is an interesting philosopher. She came out of the Ukraine. She was a young Jewish woman escaping Stalinism in the Ukraine. She went to Mexico, and she became Leon Trotsky's Russian language secretary or interpreter. And she had an argument with Trotsky, I think on two issues. One was the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Two was whether the Soviet Union was a degenerate worker state or not. And Raya had a theory that, which I actually agree with very strongly, that the ex-Soviet Union was state capitalist. That in fact, you take the ownership of the means of production, right? So you got a private ownership of the means of production, then the state owns the means of production, and you have a form of statist capitalism. It may be a step in the right direction, but if it simply remains there, that's not a segue into socialism necessarily. So, so I was reading Raya's work, and I cited her in my book on Paulo Freire and Che Guevara. And I got a message from a philosopher called Peter Hudis, who had read my book and had noticed Raya. And he said, I was Raya's secretary in the United States. He was writing from Chicago. And Peter was working to keep Raya's movement organized and alive. Raya, after her disagreement with Trotsky, went to the United States, taught Hegel and Marx to factory workers in Detroit, in Chicago. She started the Marxist humanist movement, which has split. And I followed Peter Hudis and Kevin Anderson. Kevin is a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Peter, who wasn't an academic, but one of the most brilliant Marxist thinkers I've ever met, there was a split in the movement. The other group got access to Raya's money she left after she died. And Peter had to find some way to make a living, and so he did his PhD very quickly in philosophy, and he's teaching now in Chicago. So, so I began conversations with Peter and Kevin in studying Hegel, because I really don't think you can adequately understand Marx without understanding Hegel. So here I was shifting, over the years towards a Hegelian Marxist approach that I would call Marxist humanism. And some people think that the Marxist humanist group is a little bit of a cult because the focus is so much on Raya, but I don't think that's the case at all. The Marxist humanist movement is also very much involved in the work of Rosa Luxemburg. So they have produced, or are in the process of producing, all of Rosa Luxemburg's works. They have a critique of Luxemburg, but they're strong supporters of Luxemburg's work. So that's the movement. I identify with the Marxist humanist trajectory, but what does this have to do with education? So the more I began to look at capitalism as a social relation, I began to think about, well, what are some alternatives? Marx does hint, he doesn't specifically say, this is what the world should look like after capitalism. He doesn't put that in one volume. Well, what Peter's done in his book, Marx's Alternatives to Peter Hudis, Marx's Alternatives to Capitalism, is he's gone through all of Marx's works, Marx's letters, all of the books that are available, and he drew out a kind of picture of how Marx would see a society, a social universe, if you will, outside of the production of value. Now, by value, I'm talking about monetarized wealth. So he looked at a world in which would be run by actual labor time and not socially necessary labor time. So the great discovery of Marx was the distinction between labor and labor power, abstract and concrete labor. And so he was looking at a world basically that would be one of freely associated labor, non-authoritarian, driven by a kind of permanent revolution through what Raya called absolute negativity, the negation of the negation. So for instance, you could say that communism is a negation of capitalism. Again, as I mentioned, you take the means of production and you take the means of production away from the capitalists, and right, and so the state owns the means of production. But that itself needs to be negated, because the notion of having, right, is still there. That needs to be negated. So really many of the horrible dictatorships and police states of the Eastern Bloc, Soviet Union, horrible in many ways, stopped at the first negation. Now we know that Lenin understood the negation of the negation through Hegel, because Raya translated Lenin's 1914 notebooks. So, but Lenin intellectually understood that, but the forces of the moment, I guess, were restricted his ability to act through that. When I use the language of Marxism, my students get a little nervous. We go to ecopedagogy. And so I think that ecologists years ago avoided Marx, even though he wrote about metabolic rift. But they thought that Marx really saw nature as just something to be exploited, or not necessarily exploited, but something just, it's there for the taking. And that's not true. John Bellamy Foster wrote about Marx on ecology. Jason W. Moore has written about this. Joe Covell have written about this. And they've shown how Marx was, in many ways, one of the first ecologists. And so they've done a lot to make Marx relevant to the ecology movements. Now we have the theory of cosmopolitanism. But that's not where we were at the time. We just wanted, how can people graduate, and we were focused more on universities. How can people graduate from universities and be active, public intellectuals engaged in creating a world of justice and dignity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We were using those terms. I was excited about this. And then I realized, when you're looking at the GDP, right, gross domestic product of certain countries, comparing them with, you know, the worth of corporations, the wealth of corporations, I began to realize that corporations, which were becoming more and more involved in partnerships with universities, were so powerful that we're not going to really be able to talk about critical citizenship, but we're educating, right? Education is a form of disciplining, right? Labor, right? And educating, you know, for labor power. And we're talking about consumer citizenship. So I thought that that's really where the trap is. We're educating consumers. We're producing consumers. In 2001, September the 11th, there was an attack on New York City and the World Trade Towers. After that attack, the economy was in shambles, and George W. Bush went on television and told the American people to go out and spend. That's the best thing you can do for your country, is just to go out and spend as much money as you can. You know, it's funny, I teach in a university, Chapman. It's a wonderful place. I really love the students and faculty. But you know, the students are relatively well off and very polite. And when I talk about class struggle and the struggle for socialism, they say, can't we just ask, you know, can't we just go in and make a really good argument and convince the capitalists that this is the way we should run the world? And it's like, no, it doesn't, the world doesn't work that way.